The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Beyond the Quad, Economic Security and Supply Chain Resilience in Maritime Asia. The Quad grouping provides a strategic framework focused on maintaining a free, open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Yet its effective implementation relies on broader regional cooperation. Unilateral groups alone cannot safeguard the region's critical transit choke points. Strengthening economic security and supply chain resilience in Maritime Asia requires going beyond the Quad to build practical partnerships with Southeast Asian and Pacific nations. To discuss the drivers behind this broader approach, including choke point vulnerabilities and economic coercion, and explore key priorities beyond the Quad, join our live debate to share your questions with the expert panel.
Welcome, I am Humphrey Hawksley. This is a Democracy Forum debate where we shine a spotlight into the nooks and crannies of global affairs to understand more about issues that impact all our lives. And talking of global affairs, I apologize for my backdrop. I am traveling at the moment and talking to you from a hotel room. Our topic, Beyond the Quad, Economic Security and Supply Chain Resilience in Maritime Asia. That quadrilateral dialogue, or quadrilateral security dialogue, as it's now called, is a 20-year-old concept initiated by Japan and America, who brought in Australia and India to create a unified bloc of which secure supply chains and trade routes are a central part of its mission. The concept against hostile Chinese expansion. But since then, the world has been turned on its head with the Strait of Hormuz dangling there. Who does actually threaten supply routes and who best protects them? To unpick this, we have a sterling panel, SAYANTAN, HALDAR, PREMESHA, and we hope to have COLLIN Co-SWEE from Singapore at some stage during the debate. The Democracy Forum Chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, will listen to their arguments and sum up at the end. And before all of that, I have the privilege of asking the Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the background and the canvas of the debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. Established over 2 decades ago, but increasingly facing concerns of fading relevance, the quadrilateral security dialogue may have reached a critical point in its history. Foreign ministers of its 4 member states, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, meeting in New Delhi in the spring, appear to have infused the organization with fresh impetus and a new focus on maritime issues across the Indo-Pacific. I'm grateful to the Forum for choosing this moment to highlight the purpose of the Quad and for inviting a panel of experts to consider its future and to share their perspectives with us. We look forward to hearing their contributions. And my thanks, as always, to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. Although formed in 2004 as a humanitarian initiative in the aftermath of the tsunami, the Quad was reinstated in 2017 as a security and strategic alliance. By championing a free and open Indo-Pacific, and by offering an alternative framework to China's hierarchical and coercive approach to building hegemony in the ASEAN region, the Quad attracted the enmity of China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who mocked the organization, describing it, I quote, as a headline-grabbing idea that would dissipate like sea foam. Undeterred, however, Quad members this year have announced several new initiatives aimed at enhancing collective maritime cooperation right across the Indo-Pacific region through improved logistics integration, intelligence gathering and sharing, interoperable Coast Guard operations, coordinated naval refitting and refueling, and establishing a permanent mechanism for sharing maritime information. And a leadership dialogue representing all the members' interests, Quad Track 1.5, was launched in Sydney in February to discuss maritime security, economic security, and critical emerging technologies. And this indeed may emerge as a permanent ideas incubator and Secretariat for the first time. But despite the upbeat messages appearing from the meeting in New Delhi, doubts still remain about the role of the Quad and its ability to perform. The organization has not held a leaders' conference since 2024, when President Biden hosted his counterparts at Wilmington in Delaware. And since the return of President Trump in 2025, there's been no dialogue at leadership level, and no such meetings are planned. And furthermore, the Quad is finding that several important initiatives are opposed by the Trump administration. For example, its focus on clean energy has been undermined by climate change skepticism, and its humanitarian and disaster relief planning is threatened by withdrawal of funding to US aid. But the current diplomatic standoff between the United States and India, locked in a tariff dispute, is probably the most worrying development. A recent report published by the Lowy Institute concludes that, I quote, "The Quad is not finished, but is running on diplomatic momentum rather than strategic output. Specifically, it needs to make other Southeast Asian countries an economic offer substantial enough to offset the gravity of China's trade advantages. And it needs to arrange a definitive leaders' conference. I quote, providing the Washington-New Delhi relationship can bear the weight placed upon it." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any comments or questions, please pass them to the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. The Quad are mocked by China, and then its initiatives opposed by the Trump administration as a worrying development. Our first panelist is Dr. SAYANTAN HALDAR, the Strategic Studies Program from the Observer Research Foundation. His work mainly concentrates on the Indian Ocean and the Arctic. In a recent co-authored paper, he reached through the Malacca Straits into the South China Sea with arguments entitled India-Taiwan Advancing Tech Cooperation for a Secure Maritime Future. That sounds very beyond the Quad. So, SAYANTAN HALDAR, economic security and supply chain resilience in maritime Asia. Give us your thoughts.
Thank you, firstly, to the chair and also to Lord Bruce for contextualizing the set of interventions that I wanted to come in with today. Before getting into Maritime Asia, I think I would also sort of like to discuss a little bit about the idea of the Indo-Pacific, because in many ways, I think we are at a time where the Indo-Pacific has emerged as a fulcrum of global geostrategic churning. While we do discuss the history of Quad and how its onset lies in the aftermath of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, I think a resuscitation of the Quad is what set the ball rolling in the kind of diplomatic and political momentum that we saw within the group, especially since 2017. And interestingly, it was President Trump's first administration which in many ways infused a lot of energy into the Quad and breathed new life, as it were, into the grouping. 2017-2018 was also a very interesting time because it was already a couple of years of China coming out with its Belt and Road Initiative. So in many ways, global connectivity routes, the sort of cartographies of connectivity, supply chain resilience, economic security was being rethought from a Chinese perspective. And that certainly did have an imprint on the kind of strategic thinking that went on in countries which sort of represent a democratic and rules-based order oriented worldview, so to speak. So I think in many ways the Quad's evolution, though is not formally sort of interpreted as a reaction to the Chinese onset of the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think the timeline sort of suggests that the coming together of Quad, and not just Quad, but also several other such initiatives where like-minded countries came together were sort of responding to the way in which China was emerging as a big force with the Mega Belt and Road Initiative. Now, it is a separate debate of what the trajectory of the Belt and Road Initiative has been, but I think one important focus of the Quad was to ensure that it doesn't remain limited to issues of maritime security, freedom of navigation, etc., which was broadly what its focus was towards the initial years. But increasingly, the Quad evolved the nature and characteristic of its very sort of orientation, and it sought to provide public goods. Now, that is very important because here again, I think the idea of responding to China or Chinese maximalism, so to speak, comes into the picture because importantly, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China sought to advance a kind of model of partnership that it was offering to countries within the Indo-Pacific or within the Indian Ocean in particular, where China was coming into these countries, funding infrastructure project, was emerging as a political force to reckon with in these countries. And it also did involve an element of quid pro quo, as we've seen in the examples of Sri Lanka, for example, where they built an infrastructure project in Hambantota, and once it failed to take off, the Chinese took the boat on lease for 99 years. So there was a certain model that the Chinese were advancing in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the Quad, on the other hand, though was not sort of operating a lot in terms of the economic dimension, but in terms of offering public goods. So, if you look at the Quad's agenda, it has sort of evolved over the years to turn into a more multifaceted grouping where it includes critical mineral supply chain conversations, it includes health security, it includes people to people connectivity. And in a sense, I think the effort within the Quad was also to offer an alternate model. So, with these sort of opening remarks, I would just also like to focus a bit on the way in which we are going to see conversations of economic security and supply chain resilience in the Indo-Pacific going forward. And importantly, these conversations also sort of sit at the very heart of the way in which the region is evolving, because the economic significance of the Indo-Pacific in many ways has sort of exacerbated, given not just by the fact that the resident countries are turning into important economies driving global growth, but also non-resident countries are coming up with their Indo-Pacific policies because they do see a certain degree of merit in engaging with the Indo-Pacific as the region, as well as with the political constituency of the Indo-Pacific, which is the countries which are embedded in the region in particular. So, if you also look at the way in which countries such as France are orienting their outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, even though we have known France as a European power, they did, of course, sort of reorient themselves as an Indo-Pacific power when President Macron addressed a speech at in Australia in 2018, where he said that France is also now looking to reorient itself as an Indo-Pacific power by way of its island holdings in La Reunion. So I think it's very important for us to take into cognizance the economic and strategic significance of the Indo-Pacific as such. Now, of course, the Quad, as was mentioned in the opening remarks by Lord Bruce, is undergoing a churn primarily because of the diplomatic turbulence that we are seeing increasingly between the US and its other Quad partners at a bilateral level, and more importantly, sitting from India. I think this is the most visible here, perhaps one could say. But I think if we are to look at the operational elements of the Quad as well, we will see that apart from the absence of a leader level summit, the Quad really has not faltered in any of the initiatives that it has taken forward. In fact, during the last foreign ministers meet, we have seen the elevation of maritime domain awareness into a maritime surveillance sort of a collaboration that the Quad has sought to advance within itself, within the rubric of the grouping, as it were. So I think in that sense, there is a certain degree of momentum which continues to exist within the operational elements of the Quad. But I think for a group like Quad, which is not institutionalized per se, which does not have a secretariat, which does not have a permanent bureaucracy, it is very important for the leader level summits to take place, because it is the leader level summits from where the Quad really charts out its agenda, and also sort of advances a diplomatic signaling to the world, and indeed to the Pacific as well, that it is serious when it comes to advancing cooperation in this particular region. But I think going forward, if we look at the landscape of economic security and supply chain resilience and the way in which the strategic orientation of the Indo-Pacific is unfolding, I think we need to look at opportunities by way of which like-minded countries can move beyond the template of the Quad, given the certain degree of stagnation that we have seen, at least at the diplomatic level, and look for partnerships and templates of cooperation which are similar to Quad but continue to advance the kind of interest that it represents. So, for example, if we look at trilateral partnerships, there is a lot of conversation about the India, Australia, Indonesia partnership, for example, the France, India, Indonesia, or the France, Indonesia, Australia trilateral partnership. So I think these are some of the templates of cooperation which really need to now start evolving as major agenda points of bilateral as well as trilateral dialogues at the track one level. But also, I think it's very important to look at issue-based coalitions. So, for example, if we look at supply chain resilience, apart from the technical aspects of or the business element of supply chain resilience, I think if we are to look at maritime domain awareness, that certainly has an impact on the way in which sea lines of communications are safeguarded, supply chain resilience is protected, so on and so forth. So I think if we are to look at the future of an agenda of cooperation for the Indo-Pacific, then issue-based coalitions are also very important. And as far as maritime domain awareness is concerned, I think India certainly plays a very important role in the way in which it is fostering a broader coalition of partnerships in the Indian Ocean, indeed, but also broadly in the Indo-Pacific. We have also seen within the Quad itself an element of inclusion of forums such as the IORA, which is the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or the Pacific Island Forum, for example, to foster a broader maritime security coalition in the Indo-Pacific as well. So I think if countries are able to take forward this kind of a multifaceted agenda, that really serves the purpose of building economic security or supply chain resilience in the Indo-Pacific or maritime Asia, as it were. But I think at a normative level, I think it's also very important when discussions such as this take place, that it is important to be sensitive about the strategic compulsions and interests of very many countries that exist in the region. So, for example, a lot of countries in the Indian Ocean or even in Southeast Asia do have a certain degree of economic interdependency vis-a-vis China. So, when coalitions or partnerships are forged with these countries to advance a safe, secure, and a forward-looking agenda for the Indo-Pacific, I think it is important to take into consideration the kind of interdependencies that these countries have with China. Or for that matter, if we look at even countries such as India and Australia, the reality suggests that there is a certain degree of interdependency, and therefore I think a calibrated and a more nuanced scope of cooperation needs to be cultivated among these countries. But broadly, I think if countries and governments in these countries are able to emphasize on the fact that there does need to be a free and open Indo-Pacific where economic security is of prime importance, where supply chain resilience is a primary agenda, I think that really sets the ball rolling for the agenda for the Indo-Pacific. I think in terms of a forward-looking agenda, even elements such as critical minerals, I think, is going to emerge as a very important area of conversation. And in fact, it is already a very important area of conversation for countries in the region, especially as we look at green transition, as we look at the way in which energy supply chains are being rethought, especially after the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of emphasis will now come on these particular issue areas. So I think this idea of issue-based coalition is something that the Indo-Pacific will really benefit from. So broadly, I think these are some of the opening remarks that I wanted to bring into the table, but happy to take questions going forward.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating in the breadth and detail that you gave. Is it your view, or is it the case that the way that Asia or the Indo-Pacific is looking at securing supply chains, that remains an American-led project, or has that changed?
Well, I think, as I was saying about interdependency before, I think if we are to look at especially the Western Pacific, we will see a lot of these countries are deeply embedded into the American-led security architecture. And I would imagine that the kind of anxieties that these countries are increasingly feeling, given the turbulence that they are currently facing vis-a-vis their partnership vis-a-vis America, I think a rethink certainly is in order. And I think it is important for these countries also to diversify, but keep in mind the historical element of their partnership with America. So I think only time will tell, what happens to the future of their partnership with America and, the role of America as such in the Western Pacific. But yeah, sorry.
And is China, because you talk about this interdependence, is China still seen as the nation or the force that would disrupt the supply chains? Or given the Straits of Hormuz situation, is America now on an equal footing with China? Both of these big powers could equally disrupt supply chains.
Well, I think at a normative level, certainly there is a sense of a similarity in the way in which both the countries can sort of leave an imprint on the supply chain resilience in the broader Indo-Pacific. But I would not compare the US and China as equals when it comes to the kind of anxieties that these countries feel, especially given the fact that a lot of these countries continue to depend on America for their safety and security. But I
So,
think if we are to specifically talk about issues like critical mineral supply chain resilience, a lot of the processing technology currently remains in China. So it's not just about physically hindering sea lines of communication, but also disrupting the supply chains in a more technical way.
and I'd just like to put a question that's come in from the audience. You touched on it, but the question is this: if the Quad wants to secure supply chains, which non-Quad partner is the key missing link?
Well, I think inclusion of Southeast Asia or Southeast Asian countries in some form is certainly very important purely from a geographical point of view.
So as ASEAN you're talking about, or
yes,
or one particular
yes,
country?
of course. I think ASEAN certainly is a very important factor in the way the Quad will evolve over the years, and ASEAN centrality does remain a cornerstone of Quad's approach to the Indo-Pacific. But I think practical inclusion of Southeast Asian countries is certainly a very important aspect that the Quad will need to include at some point in time going forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned that other groupings that are being formed or are formed that are not as well known as ASEAN. What is the argument for sort of expanding the Quad much more so that there becomes many more members of it?
Well, I think the Quad, of course, has a certain historical trajectory. So I think the template of Quad Plus has always been in the picture, but I think the Quad would not formally include any other fifth country. For starters, it would not remain the Quad, as it were. But in other ways also, I think the kind of political and diplomatic understanding and nuance that the Quad was able to at least capture prior to 2025 in the way in which they did accept India's position on a lot of issues, especially with regards to China, for example, I think is something which will be very difficult to replicate. And I'm not really sure if bringing other partners on board would really help that cause. But I think certainly other templates of cooperation can be identified, and the charter can be expanded. But I think for the Quad to remain limited within the 4 countries is the way forward.
Thank you very much for that. Stay with us because we're going to open it up for our 2 panelists very shortly after we've heard from Dr. Premesha Shah, a senior policy fellow at the Asia Society Australia, focusing on Indo-Pacific geopolitics and regional security architecture. Her expertise spans minilateral cooperation, great power competition, and India's Indo-Pacific policy. And among her recent papers, Securing 2 Oceans, Bolstering India's Australia Defence Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and India's role in the emerging dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. India, Australia, a lot there sounds very Quad-like, but are we beyond it? What's going on? Premesha Shah, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to first thank the Democracy Forum for inviting me to this panel. And a lot of my arguments actually match with what Shantan was mentioning, but I'll actually take off from where he left. That is, and because the framing of this session is beyond the Quad. So let me first start with the fact that when we are talking about inclusion of Southeast Asian countries in mechanisms like this, but initially when Quad was being formulated or when Quad was taking off, there was a lot of hesitation from Southeast Asia and ASEAN in general as to whether, because there were questions if countries in Southeast Asia would ever be a part of the Quad or whether they would have any interest in being a part of the Quad. So there was a lot of hesitation initially from these countries, and many of them saw Quad as a hindrance to ASEAN centrality. Countries like Australia, Japan have been, and even India have always championed ASEAN centrality, and Southeast Asia has been a predominant pillar of many of these countries' foreign policy as well. But there were a lot of questions that came up as whether these countries are now losing their interest in ASEAN or whether minilateral cooperation will now be the predominant architecture when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. But now, currently, there has been a shift in this focus, not particularly towards the Quad, but in general towards minilateral initiatives in generally. If you see, I think background, there was a mention of the Lowy Institute surveys and polls. So one of the Lowy Institute polls, I think it was Asia Power Index, but where you can see, and even in the State of Southeast Asia survey, which is released by ISEAS every year, if you see the perceptions towards Quad, you will see from the Southeast Asian countries' perspective, there has been a huge change. The perception is now growingly positive, and this has to do with how the Quad has broadened its agenda, but it has also still, in a lot of ways, kept away from hard security initiatives. So I think the concept of security, Quad has utilized that very well in broadening its agenda in various non-traditional security areas, being maritime domain awareness, critical minerals, energy security, food security, health, digital infrastructure. So there is the ambit has actually broadened. I'll give a couple of examples why I say the perception of Southeast Asian countries have changed towards minilateral cooperation. Very recently, if you see, and Shantan mentioned about Indonesia being a part of a lot of these minilateral initiatives. Just yesterday, Australia and Indonesia had their 2+2 meeting to implement the common security agreement that they signed a few months back. On the sidelines of that, we also saw the three foreign defense ministers of Indonesia, Japan, and Australia meeting. And a couple of days before that, Indonesia was doing some exercises with China bordering the Taiwan Strait as well. So you can see that these countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, are looking for diversification, but they are not looking at decoupling from either China or the United States. They are looking for diversification. Some countries like Indonesia are working with other countries or cooperating with other countries as looking at newer frontiers in the region. So we need to take this into account. And so probably now is a fruitful time for Quad not to, and I agree with Shantan, not to formally introduce members, but Quad has something called working groups, which was initiated much before. So we can, so the Quad countries can look at in various of these issue-based working groups. For instance, if it's critical minerals, with semiconductors, including these key players who are playing a bigger role or who are playing a key role in these specific sectors, can be included in these working groups so that their voices are heard, their interests are taken into consideration, and some initiatives can be formed with them as well. The other way of looking at this is something which I had suggested in one of the papers that I'd written, is how we can use minilaterals, but also scale those initiatives at a broader regional level. So for instance, and this has already been happening, some of the initiatives which are being introduced at the level of the Quad, there is already discussions, and if you see joint statements where they say that the focus should now these should be scaled to a broader regional level, be it with Southeast Asian countries or even with Pacific Island nations, for instance. So these minilateral platforms can be used as platforms for piloting initiatives. If these initiatives are successful, then given that all these countries are also dialogue partners at the level of ASEAN and are already very actively participate in a lot of ASEAN-led discussions, either at the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Maritime Forum, for instance, there are these platforms do create that opportunity for these countries to come together, jointly propose these initiatives so that these can be scaled at the regional level as well. So I think there are ways of utilizing minilaterals, even if you are not formally bringing in new members, but how you can scale them, scale minilateral cooperations at the level of regional cooperation as well. So that it is also ASEAN centrality in practice, and this debate of that minilateral cooperation is a hindrance to ASEAN centrality sort of dials down a little. Now coming back to the question which came up, and I'm following from the discussion of the panelists before me, where I think you asked that, with the US's dwindling interest and the lack of a leaders level summit, is the Quad functioning? And I completely agree with Shantan that sometimes, and let's be very honest, much of these work or initiatives which take off happen at the level of foreign and defense ministers. It doesn't always need a leaders level summit for many of these initiatives to take off, and Quad has proven that. A leaders level summit would probably give it a bigger, a bigger credence at the global level, but even the fact that the foreign ministers are meeting quite so often on the sidelines of several summits shows the growing interest among the Quad members and a recognition, especially from Australia, India, and Japan, that this initiative now has to be led by these three middle powers, even if US is not so much a dominant power in this initiative. And I think that is being seen a lot, even through these bilateral initiatives which are coming up. India and Australia, for instance, if you're talking about supply chains, India and Australia, in the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to Australia, we saw something called the PACS agreement. And the PACS agreement looks at critical technology, digital infrastructure, but supply chain is one of the key pillars of that initiative as well. Besides the Quad, there are a lot of other initiatives which are already in play. We had the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, for instance, which was formed during the which was formed during the COVID era, where Australia, Japan, and India has not taken off in a bigger way. But the IPEF as well, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, now has a supply chain pillar to it as well. So, many of these initiatives already exist. The need at the moment is not creating any further new initiatives, but how do you link all these initiatives together and create a credible alternative for countries to even look at a separate alternative than the US and China. There is a need for creating these credible alternatives. And the answer is not going ahead and creating a lot more initiatives, but about how you coordinate the existing ones and coming up with proper credible projects, which can be implemented and which can actually take off on a granular level. So I think these are the main areas of discussion. When we're talking about maritime Asia, I think the recent West Asia crisis has exposed the vulnerabilities of how, if you don't focus on maritime infrastructure, logistics network, ports infrastructure, subsea cable network, so all these have to be linked when we are talking about the bigger picture of economic security, which is in a way linked to a supply chain resilience as well. So, and that is something which the Quad leader, I think the Foreign Minister Summit took note of, where economic security now is linked to all this, all these key things. In a broader way, contributing to maritime infrastructure and logistical infrastructure. So I think this is where I'm going to stop. And I've tried to, not to repeat the points which were raised by Shanthan, but I'm happy to take in more questions from you.
No, you've just been wonderful. You've expanded, and there's a question from the audience on precisely what you said. But before we get there, I'm interested in your the three middle powers, Australia, India, and Japan, sort of taking the momentum forward on that. Is it still, and I did ask this question before, but are there any of these sort of mechanisms, meetings, groups going on that actually involve China?
Are you talking at the level of the minilateral initiatives? And yes, there are a couple. There is one which India was a part of, which was called Russia, India, China, RIC, and there was also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There is also there.
Right.
Yep. BRICS is another one. So yes, there are these initiatives already there. And if you look at India's Indo-Pacific vision, because we do not, like other countries, do not have a foreign policy white paper or defense paper, so we refer to it as an Indo-Pacific vision, it has always been inclusive. And India, this question has come that India being a non-aligned country, why is it a part of so many, and like Shanthan used the term issue-based initiatives or issue-based coalition is what India is terming it as. So India is a part of a Quad, India is a part of a SCRI, which is a Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, but India is also a part of Russia, India, China, or BRICS. So there are, India has kept its option open like many other countries, like Southeast Asia, trying to, get it. I think at the end of the day, it's about fulfilling your national interests.
And these sorry to interrupt, the options open that we've heard a lot over the past 2 decades, actually, this idea is that they don't want to have to choose between superpowers. Is that option open increased or swinging towards China or swinging in one particular direction?
So I think when we look at the US-China dependence, and since my area of expertise is Southeast Asia, I'll keep to that, we have to look at it in a more holistic way. There is dependence on China and US in very different ways. And we also have to keep in mind countries like Australia and Japan are treaty allies of the United States. And even countries like Thailand, Philippines, in Southeast Asia are treaty allies of the United States. These countries are economically dependent on China. They're hugely economically dependent on China and on the US for security reasons, for security purposes. So I think that's why I mentioned there is a need for decoupling. Completely moving away from either of the countries is not possible. I don't see that happening. And that's why they're calling this as diversification of partnership, not necessarily moving away from one power or the other. It's about looking at newer frontiers and diversifying partnerships. And that is being done by even countries like Australia, Japan, not just smaller countries in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Island nations.
And if we put the Taiwan Straits to one side, is there any evidence that China is threatening economic security or supply chain resilience in maritime Asia?
No, I don't think there is. So if we are looking at the Taiwan Strait and even the South China Sea crisis, I don't think the concern has been the disruption of supply chains there. The concern has been the question of sovereignty claims. We've seen a lot of encroachments of Chinese fishing vessels, or sometimes even Coast Guard and naval vessels in these countries' exclusive economic zones. So these have not been the question of supply chain resilience. It has been the question of maritime law, the freedom of navigation, and sovereignty claims. And one thing that we also need to take into hindrance is how these countries interpret maritime law. There are differing interpretations of maritime law even among Southeast Asian countries, and that is what sometimes leads to these differences of opinion within ASEAN as to some countries siding with some things China does and some countries not siding.
But there's no evidence at the moment of supply chains and trade routes being weaponized or being used as a threat in China's foreign policy?
So during COVID, I think it's more about, the question right now is more about how much countries can depend on any one country for all kinds of infrastructure. And I think that question came up during COVID, where countries saw that they are heavily dependent on China. In a lot of ways, they're putting all their eggs in one basket. So there was this need of diversification. I'm not an expert in Chinese foreign policy. I'm not fluent in Mandarin, so that's why I don't call myself an expert in Chinese foreign policy. But so I think Colin would be better placed to respond to this. If China has this notion of disrupting supply chains in its foreign policy calculus. But when we look at incidents, I don't think that has happened yet, but yes, disruption of international law, maritime law, freedom of navigation, sovereignty.
It is on. And the question that come in from the audience here on something you mentioned, Tracy Den Croggan, how vulnerable are transoceanic undersea cables to grey zone sabotage and contested maritime straits? I'm going to add to that in the Indo-Pacific, because we don't want to get into what's happening around Europe.
Yeah, no, this is a very critical point. And I think subsea cables, this is also growing to be an area where not just the Quad, but a lot of bilateral joint statements are also focusing on. And gray zone sabotage is there, but sometimes even subsea cables disruptions can happen, through some ship movements and also, vessel movements. But in terms of gray zone coercion and in gray zone in these maritime vulnerable straits, I think right now the focus is more on securing the infrastructure and ensuring that these subsea cable are maintained for connections and connectivity. So and a lot of this has also happened. ANU released a very good report where they mentioned that these disruptions can also happen to simple shift movements. It doesn't always.
So just to clarify that, there's no evidence that China, like Russia is in Europe, is trying to sabotage any of these cables.
I am not aware of that. No.
Thank you for that. We're going to go for a very short break, after which we're going to open up to both of you, because there are a couple of more questions from the audience. Back in just a second. Thank you very much. That is, we are now back with Sayantan HALDAR and PREMESHA SAHA, and we have two questions from the audience that I'd like to put to you before we go to Barry Gardiner, who's going to wrap up our debate. Anand Singh Tomar, if the Malacca Strait was closed tomorrow by a crisis, which secondary Indo-Pacific route is best prepared to handle the diversion? Sayantan HALDAR, which way do we go?
No, I think it's a very interesting question, and in many ways, I think the Malacca Strait sits right at the center of a lot of conversations on the Indo-Pacific. But I think the more important question here is, what is the source of the disruption? I think that will in many ways also dictate the way in which new routes need to be reimagined. I think at least from an Indian point of view, there is a sense that there needs to be diversification of sea lines of communication in terms of the way in which our cargo vessel partnerships are taken forward, maritime logistics is being thought through, as well as in the way in which interoperability exercises are going forward in a way in which we are able to safeguard the maritime domain, so to speak. So I think a lot of conversation, at least in India, I think also is taking shape on the way in which the Northern Sea route is evolving as a very important transit corridor for India, especially as we are seeing the effects of climate change in the Arctic, and how it's a bit of a contradiction, but how the melting of ice in the Arctic is actually opening up opportunities for new transit corridors. So I think the Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor in many ways sits right at the heart of these conversations. But I think this again, to come back to the common disclaimer here, I think a lot of these conversations are still at a very nascent stage, because we don't really have a lot to show for what are the kind of developments that have taken place with regards to the Chennai Vladivostok corridor. At least in terms of a policy understanding, there is this sort of this is there in common parlance. But I think what are the practical steps that have been underway to sort of facilitate such a maritime corridor? I think these are some of the questions that need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. PREMESHA SAHA, can I put that to you? But also, can you give us a comparison on the closure of the Malacca Straits compared to the closure of the Straits of Hormuz? One's much bigger, isn't it?
Yeah, but I in a very practical scenario, I think given that Malacca Strait borders mainly Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and we've heard the Singaporean foreign minister and also the leader of the country very clearly mentioned that such a situation is not going to evolve from the Southeast Asian countries' perspective, because this debate was being linked in many ways, but Singapore has very clearly mentioned that this is very difficult to happen, because also we need to be very careful that these are themselves island nations who are very much dependent on these sea lanes of communication and also the port infrastructure. Another is that besides the Strait of Malacca, and this sometimes misses the discussion, is this region, Southeast Asia, has a lot of other important sea lanes of communication. We have Lombok, there is Sunda, Makassar, Omboy, Veta Straits. So closure of Strait of Malacca can create these alternative routes. Obviously, Omboy, Veta is more suited for submarine routes, but there can be these alternative routes. But we have seen from Southeast Asian countries, and especially leaders, saying that this is not a step that they're going to be taking, because international law to them is very important. And Southeast Asia has always put international law at the forefront, because South China Sea has always formed a very important discussion point, even at the level of ASEAN.
I think that's a very good point you made. In order to close those trade routes, you also have to shut off the 4 or 5 choke points, they're called, aren't they, that run through Indonesia. So it's not just a matter of sort of closing those very narrow straits. The last question from Rashid Ali, fascinating. Can a cooperative recycling framework for rare earth metals offset current mining monopolies? Sayantan HALDAR.
Well, I think it's a bit of an interesting question, because when we talk about critical minerals and rare earth metals, etc., I think a lot of it also needs to sort of be based on the fact that it is ultimately a reaction to natural endowment. We can't really fight what the nature has endowed to some of these countries, right? But I think where the diversification really can come in is if countries are able to boost technologies in a manner where recycling capabilities or processing capabilities are developed. Now, if we look at the current landscape, we will see that China currently dominates the processing technologies and the recycling technologies that exist in critical minerals as well as in rare earth metals. But I think if countries such as India or even Australia, for that matter, which already is a leader in the space of critical minerals, or even Southeast Asia, we have some partner countries in Latin America as well. I think if we are able to sort of build a coalition where we can focus on how naturally endowed critical minerals are sort of then carried to countries or zones where processing technologies are evolving at a very rapid rate, I think that can in many ways inject a sense of resilience in the way in which recycling or processing technologies can evolve.
So this is a new, beyond the Quad institution or coalition, as it were. PREMESHA, SAHA, what are your views?
Yeah, I think I agree with Shantan. And over here, I would want to, Australia, and I've repeatedly mentioned this, that Australia needs to think of itself beyond just an upstream supplier. And it has to, look at beyond this picture of, their minerals is getting processed somewhere, produced somewhere. There's a need for cross-border industrial ecosystems. And, with Australian minerals, Indian processing and manufacturing capacity, Japanese technology and capital, and then Southeast Asian manufacturing networks and markets. This is something that we need to look into. And this is, we just hosted the Australia-India Track 1.5 dialogue, where we mentioned this very categorically to the Australians, that there's a need for them to just, for instance, we had many of these Australian big mining companies already present in India, but some have also moved out. Like Rio Tinto was there for around 15-20 years, but they have moved out of a few years back. But there is we have Woodside, there is BlueScope. So these discussions are already happening, and there is a need to look at cross-border industrial engagements. Maybe a mandate for the Quad, but also this can be taken up at the level of ASEAN, because ASEAN's new economic master plan looks at critical minerals as one of the focus areas of cooperation as well.
Thank you very much for that. We're getting a little bit beyond the Quad, but now we're going to Barry Gardiner, the chair of the Democracy Forum, who's been listening in, member of Parliament, member of the ruling party in Britain. Barry, what's your view on our discussion?
Humphrey, thank you very much. Let me cut this off.
We're having some wonderful music from...
wonderful technical difficulties there. I have to have two bites at the show, because usually one of my apparatuses fail, so I have them both on, so that even though the conversation blanks out on one screen, it keeps going on the other. So that's why I have the feedback loop, I'm afraid. Well, now talk about feedback. We've had quite a bit of feedback to this original question. Or was it a question? Beyond the Quad, economic security and supply chain resilience in maritime Asia. I don't see a question in there. Now, Lord Bruce, Charles opened up our debate, referring to the history, talking back to the tsunami of 2004 and the aftermath of that, and highlighting the 2017 security alliance, which really developed to counter Chinese hegemony at that stage. I loved his quote from Wang Yi, saying that the Quad was basically a headline that would dissipate like sea foam. If only in English we could be quite so poetic with our diplomatic language. And he talked of the Quad now being much more of coordination around maritime infrastructure, and the move there towards economic and national security. And of course, he raised the wild card of President Trump and the friction that the second Trump administration had injected into the Quad, both around the issues of clean energy and human rights, but also now in terms of the US's relationship or deteriorating relationship with India. Now, Sayantan Haidar started off again looking to 2017, and he talked very much about what was going on in that era with the Belt and Road Initiative from China. But also, I think he saw the Quad not necessarily as a direct response to Belt and Road, but that sense in which there was a need to ensure maritime security, to deliver economic security, as China was expanding its infrastructure into Southeast Asian countries. He mentioned the Hambantota in Sri Lanka, the port that the Chinese established there. And he focused, though, on the regions and the economic significance that has escalated in the South Asian region. And he said that he thought that this had made the Quad more relevant rather than less. And of course, he cited the case of France beginning to refocus its attention in the Indo-Pacific. He talked about the underlying turbulence, and he made a very significant point, I thought, when he said that operationally, there isn't a bureaucracy that's driving the Quad to advance practical cooperation. He says that the leaders' summits come together, but it's not as if there is a civil service, a bureaucracy that is then taking that momentum and systematizing it in a coordinated fashion. And he also suggested that the region needs to look beyond the Quad, and said, he gave examples of how it was developing bi- and trilateral cooperation. And he said not only looking at it that way, but also looking at it from issue-based coalitions that were increasingly driving what was going on. He said about the need for sensitivity about the strategic realities for smaller countries. Their interdependence on China couldn't just mean that they signed up to one side or the other, but that a free and open Pacific was a basic foundation for these countries. And of course, he talked again about critical mineral supply chain and the way in which that impacted on all of those countries' desire to embrace new energy technologies. Now, Dr. Saha tried to take us beyond the Quad, and she spoke of the inclusion of Southeast Asian countries, originally ASEAN concerned about its centrality, but now she saw a shift in general to minilateral cooperation, as she called it, the Quad broadening beyond that military defensive horizon, much more to be focused on the wider economic, but also the health, the food security, the cooperation around those supply chains. And she cited the 2+2 meetings that show countries looking to diversify. So I think she thought now is the time to include other key players in the Quad working groups, but maybe not to expand the Quad itself. I think there was a very nuanced position that she adopted there, saying, look, a lot of this is happening in the penumbra, in the periphery of the Quad. The Quad is looking more outwardly. There are these 2+2 meetings. There is the minilateral cooperation, but it doesn't mean that the Quad itself has to become a quint or a sext or a septuplet or whatever it would then become. And given that everyone involved in ASEAN saw a greater opportunity to scale that minilateral cooperation, she thought that was the route to going forward rather than a straightforward expansion. Now, we talked about the problem of America again, and it was interesting that she said the slack is being taken up there by Australia, by Japan and India. And she spoke of other supply chain initiatives and the need to be linked together to create projects under existing frameworks. The issues, I think, quite clearly relating to that maritime infrastructures, subsea cables, port networks, maritime route coordination, all of these critical to a well-functioning Southeast Asian economy. The question was raised about Indians' non-aligned status, and I think she felt that this was a shrewd preservation of national interest. And it was interesting when she spoke of the Philippines, saying how they were dependent upon China economically, but dependent on the US militarily. So this idea that you have to jump one way or the other, you're either friend or foe, much as President Trump seems to want people to do that, I think she was clear that that is not really a viable option for many of these countries. Humphrey, I think you posed one of the questions about whether China was threatening supply chains and said, leaving Taiwan Straits aside, was there a problem here? And I thought it was a really subtle answer that Dr. Saha gave there when she talked about, look, there are different interpretations of maritime law. The Convention on the Law of the Sea is open to different interpretations. And I think she felt there is no evidence of China weaponizing trade routes or doing anything other than what it thinks, in accordance with the maritime law, it is entitled to do. Thought that was very interesting. Tracy Eden Croggan asked about the vulnerability of the undersea cables. And again, yes, it's important to secure the maintenance, came the reply, but no evidence of sabotage. Anand Singh Tomar asked, what's the plan B if the Malacca Straits closed? And I think the general answer there was, it ain't gonna happen, boss. This is not something that the countries of the region would want or allow, because of the very complex interdependency between the countries that border that area. And the final question that was thrown into the mix in the 1 minute that I have left of our hour, can a cooperative recycling framework for rare earths and critical minerals offset those supply chain vulnerabilities? And I think the response was that Australia needs to perhaps buck up its game about looking outwards on that. But the Asian New Economic Master Plan is actually focusing on this as a key element of future prosperity. So all in all, I'm sorry we didn't have our third interlocutor today, but I did think that our two speakers gave a really sterling performance to take us much more deeply into this whole issue of beyond the Quad and how it's functioning and what may come in the future. Thank you.
Barry, thank you. And I agree. I think with the two there, we really covered a lot of ground. And before we leave, I'd just like to go back to each of you for a top-line headline that comes out of our debate. Beyond the Quad, economic security and supply chain resilience in Maritime Asia. We do not know if it is a statement or a question. Sayantan, HALDAR, give us your 10 seconds on that.
No, I just want to close by one statement, which is the Quad may still be here to stay. We should not write the Quad off just yet, but I think we should brace for opportunities to sort of diversify. But I think fundamentally the template of cooperation that the Quad sought to advance is going to be imperative in the way in which regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific will move going forward.
Thank you. Diversification and evolution, it sounds to me. PREMESHA, SAHA?
I would just give my 2 cents. One is, even if US is, as I mentioned, even if US is losing its interest in the Quad, there are 3 other very capable middle powers who are taking this put forward. And in terms of beyond the Quad, one thing we need to keep in mind when we're talking about Southeast Asia, even before Quad came, Southeast Asian countries were already a part of minilateral cooperation, issue-based coalitions. We have the Malacca Straits Patrol, there is the MICTA, there is Eye in the Sky initiative. So this thing about that it's going to hamper our centrality and there is no probability of these countries ever being a part of Quad-led initiatives is something that I don't agree with.
And Humphrey, if I may just add to that, I would say that even if President Trump is losing interest in the Indo-Pacific, it doesn't necessarily mean that America is. President Trump is there temporarily. America will continue to be.
That's a very good point from all of you summing up. I love those headlines, but Time's Winged Chariot is attacking us. So thank you, Sayantan, HALDAR, and PREMESHA, SAHA, and thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this really important debate happen. Our next Democracy Forum debate is on September the 23rd, and it is going to be in person with people in the audience, as well as being recorded and live streamed. It's in central London. The topic is Voice of the Global South, India's growing regional and international influence. If anybody in the audience here will be in central London and wants to attend, email info, I-N-F-O, info at thedemocracyforum.org.uk. That's info at thedemocracyforum.org.uk. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal